Today on the Debrief, we're saying ask us anything. It's our first of hopefully many question and answer episodes where we talk about, well, whatever you're talking about. If you have a question you'd like answered in our next episode, you can leave a comment here on YouTube or email debrief@fingerlakes1.com. You can also send us a message directly over on Substack, where we're now publishing every podcast episode. So without further delay, here's Jackie Augustine and I answering your questions about recent headlines across the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. All right, Jackie, before we get to the meat and potatoes of today's episode, we have to hit a couple topics that are near and dear to our hearts. And we're going to start with assessments because the city of Geneva is once again going through the assessment process. That means residents have been getting their notices about what their assessment is going to go up to, potentially. And there's been a lot of reaction to it. And last night you watched a meeting that Geneva City Council held to gather feedback or talk about the process or budget or all of the above?
Yes, so they had a special meeting that was called in response to the assessments. And I mean, I have to say, I thought the idea of the meeting in the first place seemed a little wild to me because the opening, like the approach to the meeting was, this came as a surprise. We learned on May 4th that this was happening, and we just need to get some answers. And, I don't expect that everybody follows local stuff as much as we do, but I do expect that the people who are elected to public office would have remembered that this has been in the works and under discussion. I went back through the city council minutes because I'm a nerd and I want to go right to the source material. And, it was discussed at least 4 meetings in 2025 that this was happening, which I guess the people who are new this year, there's 3 of them, like they could get a pass, I suppose. But the idea that this was a surprise, I mean, I hope that they were at least paying attention when they were running for office. But yeah, so the tenor of the meeting kind of got off to the first step of oh my goodness, what's happening? Sky's falling. And I think over the course of the meeting, the assessor, that usually it's the staff who can give some context and explanation about what's going on and how this works. And I really think that staff did a good job of teasing out the difference between what your house is assessed at, which, again, that's for most people, it's your biggest asset. There would be something wrong in Geneva if assessments were dropping. Like I ask everybody, if you opened that letter and it said your assessment had tanked, that would be cause for alarm. But I understand the reason people are upset that their assessments have gone up. And I will say I am one who's on that high end. I'm not contesting it because what I'm contesting, what I want to control is the tax levy, the actual spending, which is what results in the tax bill. So people are upset because they think, oh, my assessment went way up. That means my tax bill is going to double or go up by the same percentage. And that's not how it works. Unfortunately, that could be what happens if this council does what it has done in the past, which is treat a reassessment as an opportunity to spend more and call it a flat tax rate. Or to say, look, we didn't raise your tax. Well, it's the same thing. We didn't raise your tax rate because we actually just had all this additional levy to spend.
Yeah, for me, and I didn't watch the meeting last night, but the reaction, especially watching and reading what homeowners in Geneva have been sharing on social media, really just brings me back again to the fundamental misunderstanding that people have with how the process works. You mentioned a couple of the really important pieces, but also just the very clear indication for me that people don't understand the housing market and what it looks like. And, I see folks, sharing, their old assessments, say like $125,000 or $145,000 or $150,000. And assessments rarely reflect what a house is actually worth on the open market, especially with a lot of communities around the Finger Lakes that have largely avoided reassessments at all costs. They'll delay, 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 and typically that just winds up being a bigger shock for people, for those homeowners, because the jump ends up being bigger. But it didn't take long for me to see some of those, compare addresses, and see that, yeah, your assessment was $125,000 before, but if you put your house up for sale, it's going to sell for $250,000 or $260,000. So if your assessment is intended to be a reflection, some sort of reflection of what the value of the home is, it can't be the number that it was before. It just can't.
Right.
And
Right.
unfortunately, it's one of these scenarios where oftentimes I hear people, and it's like you want to have your cake but eat it too, or something to that effect, because it's like you want the low assessment, but as soon as you put your house up for sale, you want to get the most money you possibly can for it
Yeah. I
because
mean,
it's an asset.
imagine trying to sell your house and you list it for 280, but your assessment is still 150. You're not going to, I mean, someone's going to ask why the disparity, right? So again, like you're saying, having a higher assessment is, all things considered, not a bad thing. It only becomes a bad thing against the backdrop of what else is going on with fiscal policy in that particular jurisdiction. And
Yeah.
that, I mean, it was strange to me that nobody mentioned at the meeting last night, or at least, and I was paying attention, but it's possible I missed this part. So I apologize in advance if that's the case. But I didn't hear any extended discussion about the fact that Geneva gets an apportionment of county sales tax based on total assessed value. So the fact that our assessed value is going up means that there will be an increased diversity of non-property tax revenue coming to the city, which is a plus. But also, well, I mean, I guess I'll hold this point for later, but there was kind of a discussion about senior and veteran tax exemptions and whether that is a problem. And it wasn't clear to me that the elected officials really understood the difference between a exemption that is supposed to help people of a certain group pay their property taxes versus people's houses being assessed at fair market value. That seemed to be a real disconnect in the conversation, and the assessor tried to explain it a couple of times, and I'm not really sure. I think the audience was getting it. And that's the thing. I mean, I feel like it was helpful. The meeting was helpful in terms of bringing information to residents directly, which I wish council just did more of in general. I shouldn't have to take a perceived crisis for them to want to educate the public. And I do think the new mayor has been doing a good job of doing what I call these kind of show and tells, where he has a department head come in and kind of explain to people what they do. I hope he's doing that for the benefit of the residents, and that the counselors would find ways to get that information themselves, because I'd prefer they use their governing time to actually govern rather than on the job training. But, I thought that part was helpful, the part that allowed people to ask questions directly. And the assessor made very clear that she's going to be available for people to help answer questions as well, but that really they're blaming her for a policy and financial policy problem that they need to be looking to their elected officials for.
Assessors have the worst job, I think, in all of government. It easily is close to it. The assessment process is incredibly complex. I wrote a column, feels like it was 5 or 6 months ago, but it was probably just a couple months ago. And the amount of response that I got from folks in the assessment world and in that part of government was pretty impressive. And it's the complexity combined with the fact that there isn't really an easy way to explain it to residents. Last night's a really good example of something that communities can do to dispel, misinformation and try to get people zeroed in. But you're talking about a relatively small number of people compared to the whole population, right? Who are really going to consume that. And I know communities do the mailers and everything like that, but at the end of the day, like it's a very straight up process. Like there isn't any thoughts and feelings aren't really going into it.
Right.
It's just like, here's the data. this is what it looks like. You can contest it if you want. And I know a lot of times like assessors, and communities do respond to folks who challenge their assessment to try and get a lower number. Like there is a bit of like give and take there for the folks who do go through the process. But in general, like it's a laid out right in front of you kind of thing where you can get a good rough idea of what your house or your home or your property is really worth just by going on to the Zillow or Realtor or whatever. Choose whatever one you want,
Well,
and
she
go
did
through.
caution against using Zillow, but that was
But so, and
but
I hear
a
that.
rough
I
estimate.
heard that before too. But like, there is such a disconnect between reality of the housing market and what some people who have owned their homes for or been in their homes for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that in order to close that gap, you need, like, I think people need to spend more time looking at what's for sale, what has recently sold. And you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the assessments on real estate listings. That situation you described is happening pretty often now, where like homes are listed $100,000, $125,000, $130,000 over what they're assessed at. I've seen it in Wayne County. I've seen it in Ontario County. I've seen it in Seneca County, because assessments just the rate of change in the housing market over the last 5 years is not something that could have been absorbed by the way we do assessments in New York State, right? Like it just couldn't possibly keep up because the market has changed so much since COVID that the numbers are never going to look the way they should on paper. But I guess I to put a little bit of a happy note on the end of it, I'm glad people are paying attention to that meeting last night. I'm glad Geneva did it. And kudos to the assessor for standing tall and answering questions.
Yes. I think it would be great if that became part like, we should have a library of, like, meetings, informational meetings that people well, I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do on this podcast, but, it'd be nice that if people could see how things are gonna work before they are shocked, right? Because I think the problem is where a in a well-functioning city there would have been more information coming out ahead of this just to make sure everybody understands here's what the process is, here's what's going to happen. You could probably go on Zillow right now and get a sense of what your estimate might be, although again, she cautioned not to use Zillow. But to your point, keeping people up with how these decisions are made instead of people open the envelope, there's outrage, and then the city council, instead of responding with steady, good information, gets caught up in the outrage. And, you've got counselors that are like, my commercial property has done this. I need to show you that's not right. And I'm thinking, okay, first, could you step back from your own personal interest for a second and think about the
Yeah.
public good? But second, the person who was saying that was on the council when this was announced a year ago. So why not
Yeah.
have done this work ahead of time? So that's what bothers me is the kind of attempt to score some political points out of it instead of just treating it like governing.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Do you know if Geneva is planning on hearing the public anymore on this, or was it a one and done sort of night?
Well, again, I think the assessor who provided, her direct cell number is going to continue hearing from people. They did outline what the process is for like a preliminary request. The letter that came out with people's assessment kind of gets the process started. And then a discussion of what the grievance process is and the grievance form. The Board of Assessment Review will meet. She said that they will do more than one hearing date. That's a quasi judicial board. They will do more than one hearing date if required to make sure everybody gets their day in almost court. And then the assessment roll doesn't become final until August 1st. So there is still, but people have to get their stuff in right now, but there
Yeah.
is going to be some time. So I
Good.
expect most city council meetings that allow public comment will have something about this in the coming months.
All right. So let's turn to a question that we got that is actually related to Geneva. A couple days ago, Geneva City Council announced, or the city announced, that City Council would be moving to 2 meetings per month, basically to, I guess, to give the public a better opportunity to be engaged, probably to make things a little more organized, smooth things out, maybe make the meetings function a little better. The question that came in was, will this make a difference, or is this indifferent kind of change for City Council?
I guess I didn't realize that wasn't already the way they were doing things. I mean, a 2 meeting per month cadence has kind of been standard. There was general meeting and then work session for years and years and years. This council has gotten off to a rip roaring start of many, many meetings because it seems like at every meeting, and I keep thinking, oh, it's because they're new, but there's really only a couple of new people on it. But there do seem to be just constant questions about the most basic operations of government. So I think they keep meeting because they're still trying to learn. Do I think it's going to make things more efficient or effective? I'm going to remain optimistic, and I'm going to say at some point, I think they will be well poised to start governing in earnest once this information gathering session is complete. So if that speeds that process along, then yes, I guess it's a good thing.
Okay. I actually lean toward it being a great thing. And even if the results don't necessarily immediately become clear, I think city government meeting more frequently is a good thing. I think I've said it on the podcast a bunch of times before, but the city of Auburn City Council meets weekly. I think you just have a better, more engaged elected body that way. You're not moving through as many things. You don't have as much time in between meetings where things can be forgotten, because I know, these uh, elected folks aren't always, remembering every single solitary thing that they, talked about at a meeting 30 days ago, or all the conversations that they had between that session and the new session. So I like the tighter timeline. I think, unfortunately, it's a lot more work for city staff to be
Yes,
in that kind of
that's
cycle.
clear.
So I feel a little bit for them. I hope they can manage that part of it, and it's not like just a gigantic burden on them. But I think, generally speaking, governing bodies that meet more frequently have a better chance of becoming, one, cohesive, and two, a little better at operating, just based off of meeting more frequently, going through the process more frequently. And yeah, I think it's a general good thing. I'm not saying every city should meet the way Auburn does and do it weekly. It works for them. I don't know that it would work for Geneva or Canandaigua, but that's where that's the comparison I make. And I smiled when I read the news online afterward, because I was like, oh, good, meeting more
Well,
often.
good.
Can't
Then
hurt.
I'm smiling too. Good. You've convinced me.
Okay, school budget votes were yesterday, and actually the reaction question is pretty simple. Only two in the entire region got voted down: Odessa Montour and Prattsburgh, both little, what most people would consider to be bordering on the southern tier rather than the core Finger Lakes region. The reason why I wanted to quickly talk about this was because I thought, with all of the chatter and debate, a still unresolved state budget, electric school buses being like just talked about every single day on social media and in the news, and a litany of other issues related to schools and how they're funded and uncertainty, I thought for sure that we were going to see so many more get voted down, and it just didn't happen. And like, a lot of them weren't even close. A lot of them were very typical of other years where, they passed by like a 3-1 margin, and it's just like it's not even remotely contested, really. Were you surprised by that, or am I alone?
Uh, I mean, I guess I was expecting that the school budgets would pass, because I think generally people are supportive of a well-educated citizenry. But I guess if you were just looking online at the kind of comments going around about, especially in light of these assessments, right? It seems like there are a lot more people upset about their potential tax bills than went to vote in opposition to an increase in their school tax bill, which
Yeah.
just makes me wonder, like, I mean, it makes me worried that people just really are only happy to be engaged online, but aren't actually like, I want to make it clear. I'm not saying people should have voted against the school budget, but what I'm saying is if there's that much outrage, why isn't it reflected in voting? Like, where is the disconnect that people don't understand that the way to fix a policy is not on Facebook, but in the voting booth?
One thought I have on that, and I have a draft column that's just been sitting in the hopper for like a month now, and I haven't had time to finish it. I think there is a real, like, I think people are tired. I think people spend so much energy debating and posting and doing the things that they do on the internet that combine that with everything else that they have to do in life, work, raise families, keep their marriages and their families happy and everything else like that. I really do think like there's a fatigue thing where it's like I have to go to a meeting, I have to go I have to go vote. I think it's like because it's so easy to be engaged online because of these phones that we have, that I think people spend so much energy doing that that they don't have much left to do anything else.
I think that's probably true. And I guess I would just continue to say, like, you've got to put your energy where it's going to be effective. And I guess I've always trying to shout from the rooftops that it's in local government, it's in voting, it's in elections. That's where the decisions are being made. So we could wait and spend all our time debating the decisions after they're made, or we can be part of getting people in who are going to make different decisions.
That is an excellent place to leave that topic. Let's talk for a second about the state budget. I was reading a piece in New York Focus last week that really got at the growing frustration around how the state's budget process has been playing out in the last few years. Democrats are now starting to say that the system feels like it's broken because the governor has too much power, and you've got a lot of big policy debates that are getting like wrapped into the budget, and there's some contention around who's really in the room when those decisions are being made and those deals are being negotiated out, instead of it being a real public legislative process. And we got a question from one of our listeners that really fit well with this. If we could change one thing about the budget process, what would it be at the state level?
Wow.
It's hard, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first answer, I don't know that this fixes everything, but I think the first answer for any problem in government at any level is transparency, right? If I mean, and this is the big issue with the state budget. I mean, people are absolutely right. Like the 3 men in a room, which is what the process used to be called, and now has been somewhat modified, because we have a female governor, so at least there's at least one woman in the room. But the idea that this is happening behind closed doors, that there are other interests that get an outsized input or sway, or, have a thumb on the scale in how decisions are being made, it leads to a lot of speculation, mistrust, a lot of protests. I mean, look at how many groups have been going to Albany to protest particular changes, policy changes during this budget process. It seems like the legislative priorities should come first, and then the budget should fund those priorities. Instead, it seems like we're always chasing the budget with policy and trying to figure out how to take the money that someone else has decided ought to be spent and make sure it goes to somewhat of the right things. And that seems backwards. So I would say transparency in the process, if everything had to be done out in the open, which all government should be.
I think we're pretty close to the same answer, because what I wrote down was the calendar. I think the calendar needs to change. I don't love how the calendar operates. It's basically like, mid to late January through, on paper, it's supposed to be April 1st. It's not April 1st because we're
Which is
recording
quite
this on
funny.
May 20th. It's like, but I know like the legislative session runs into June. That's fine. But I just don't think there's enough time to have to really have all of these debates publicly, like what is being talked about now. Like the reason why you get kind of like this one big policy and financial package in one shot is because all of the energy is going into this one thing.
Mhm.
And there isn't really time for independent legislative debate. Like I feel like and this is just sort of my view watching historically over the last like 10 years, you'll have some legislative debates happen, but they're never really acted on. They're usually like wrapped into the subsequent year's budget. But like a debate will happen now and it will be part of the 2027 budget
Right.
process and it'll be debated a little more, but it'll almost be a foregone conclusion that if it had the right support this year, it's going to be wrapped into next year's, or if it doesn't, there's just no chance that it's going to happen the next year, which is why I think some legislation just kind of like dies on the vine in New York State. I think of the single payer healthcare bill that for a number of years was just kind of like sitting there. And I remember some of my friends saying when Democrats took total control of over all the legislative levers of state government, they were like, it's going to happen. Like there's no way that New York doesn't get this through. And I think beyond like special interests and the various dollars that flow into our political system, I really do think that like the calendar itself and the process by which you get legislation enacted in Albany is the biggest reason why something like that can't happen, because it's almost like you're telegraphing to all the special interests exactly what you're going to do, and you
Right.
give them all of this time to plan and lobby and defeat it before it even has the chance to
Mhm.
like get legs and just be like considered on the merits. And so to me, the calendar is the thing that needs to change. And like you, I think you said it perfectly. It does it feel like it would almost be like flipping the calendar backwards then?
So starting now
Like
for next.
you do the yeah, or like I guess what I'm thinking is instead of because it always seems like we lead with the budget and then there's supposed to be like open
Right.
legislative session afterward, but once the budget is done, everybody pretty much just like puts their coat on and leaves, heads for their home district afterward. Like it almost feels like it needs to be flip the inverse of that. You do a bunch of like policy sharpening the first say 30 to 45 days and then you figure out what the budget is after that. I know I'm repeating what you said. You said it best, but to me it just feels like flipping the calendar and maybe extending it a little bit, because I'm not sure, given the complexity of some of these bills and the sheer volume of bills that are on the table at any given time, this like 5 month window is really works. I don't
No.
think it works.
No, no, it clearly does not.
All right. So let's move on to responding to some of the comments that came in after our last episode. We were talking about the future of some of the communities across the Finger Lakes and central New York. We were talking about kind of the decline that a lot of communities are seeing and facing, and we're going to go comment by comment here and just sort of
Okay.
respond to them. First one up is, quote, the obvious issues are always avoided. New York State, like most of the Northeastern states, will continue to decline. They don't know how wealth is created. They don't know how businesses are built, and they do everything possible to make local conditions as uninviting as possible. The decline has a long way to go. Not a very uplifting comment, if I must say. Pretty grim.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say if we look at some of the business decline in Upstate, and you've written about this several times, it tracks with population decline. It tracks with inadequate housing choices. It tracks with local policies as well as state policies. I don't want to let the state off the
Yeah.
hook, but is the cost of doing business in New York State high? Yes. Was that a sustainable thing when the quality of life and the other thing when the demographics of the communities were just plain larger? Like, I mean, the thing is, like, certain systems run well for certain numbers of people, and when those numbers
Yeah.
change, the amount of money that has to be thrown into those systems to try to keep them up to date, relevant, and responsive ends up depressing the, I don't know what, the like attraction factor of people moving into those jurisdictions. So then we see people making
Yeah.
choices to go other places. So, I mean, growth follows growth. Like, I think that's, I don't know, a simpler way to say it than that. So I think, you know, if you're trying to get to the root cause of what is constraining growth, I mean, we've discussed a lot of that: housing, insufficient electrical upgrades, privileging certain industries over the needs of residents. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah, and for me, this just taps into that like resentment that people have towards state government, no matter what. And you see it a lot more out in the Finger Lakes and in central New York where it's more rural. But at the end of the day, like the state, yeah, the state is responsible for a lot of the cost that's associated with doing business or living in New York State. But communities have the opportunity, and I thought this was the whole point of the conversation I thought that we were having was that even with as bad as things may look for some communities, individual communities still have so much wiggle room and so much they can do individually and together to make conditions better in their areas and essentially create little havens, I guess, of opportunity, little opportunity zones.
Right.
And they just aren't doing it for the most part. And that, I think, is like the crux of the issue. Like you can continue, like everyone can continue pointing at Albany and say, geez, they stink. Like that's why everything is so hard in New York State. Or, you can roll your sleeves up if you're in local government, or if you're not in local government, you can roll your sleeves up and volunteer and get involved and get on these different boards and bring ideas to the table.
Right.
Talk to your local electeds. I tell you what, like if you live in a small rural community and you start showing up to meetings and you start like proposing good ideas, you're not just going to be listened to, you're going to be recruited to run for something. So you'll be able to do whatever you want to do, but you have to do. You can't just talk about how terrible everything is, because that's the only way that we're guaranteeing the path we're on now, which
Yeah.
I think we both agree isn't the best path at the moment, especially in some of the communities that are really dealing with the issues or conditions that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, the essence of that complaint is New York State's making it so hard for us to be exactly what we used to be all that time ago. And it's like, yes, because conditions have changed and you've not adapted. And the problem is that model of doing things has gotten more expensive and you've not come up with a way to efficiently up the operations.
Yeah.
But
All right. Comment number 2. I knew it was only a matter of time before we got this one. Annex New York City from upstate New York, and upstate would be better. Not to mention, a lot of people would vote with their pockets. End quote.
okay, so I guess since we have to take the quote as it is, I would just point out to annex something means to take on or to join. So I don't think the person is suggesting annexing New York City because that's already our
They mean
existing.
they mean the opposite.
I think they mean the opposite, but
Yeah.
unshackle upstate, right? The old mode of, and all I can say is
Well,
please learn some basic economics about donor and receiver dynamics here. I mean, you know, even locally, you look at Ontario County, if we better understood the dynamic of Geneva as a donor city to Ontario County as opposed to the narrative that is inappropriately spun that we are somehow a recipient community, we would have different policies. And I think, again, this idea in our upstate minds that somehow New York City is a drain on us just shows that people don't understand. First of all, New York City operates under a totally different municipal law, right? There is a specific New York City code set of laws, budgeting, appropriations is already operating as a fairly freestanding beast. And what the flywheel effect of the New York City economy is actually making possible some of the stuff that for the rest of the state that if we tried to go it alone, well, well, I mean, only
Look,
Mississippi knows where we would end up.
well, so like, yeah, like all I'm going to say to this comment is it's a completely unserious idea. And that word is going to be used in our next comment that we're responding to. And there isn't really anything else to be said there. Life in upstate New York would become so radically different and worse if New York City were separated financially from the rest of the state. New York City would be fine. The rest of upstate New York would most certainly not. But that's really all there is to say about it. It's not going to happen. We can't even get a budget 45 days late. You think we're going to be able to separate a whole city from the rest of the state? Please. Please. All right. Next comment came on YouTube. Quote, voters elect officials. The issue is not the officials, it's the voters. In general, we are an unserious people. End quote. No lies detected. That's all I can say to that. No lies detected. Like, this is the thing that we sometimes we take it on the chin for being critical of elected officials, whether it be when we're writing our columns or when we're sitting on this podcast talking about various things happening. But like, we also are pretty critical of voters too. Like, you have to be engaged if you want something to actually change in your community. It won't just change because you thought about it. Like, you have to go do. And like, if you don't like what your electeds are doing, they're a reflection of what the voting body produced. Look in the mirror.
Yeah. That is a fair criticism, because I do, I'm always saying like, oh, poor residents, like look at the people we've got representing us. But that comment is right. Like, how did the people representing us get there? We voted them in. So I think I've said this before, I've said this in a couple of columns, so I apologize for being a broken record about this. Not about the comp plan, something else. If we treated elections the way they really should be, which is that we are interviewing people for jobs, important jobs, running the operations, making critical decisions, like treating the community like a household. Who do we want to put in charge of managing the budget, of deciding what we do and don't do, setting our values, setting the course? If we took that job seriously, I think our elected officials would, in some cases, look much different than who we send now. But it's both a function of people not stepping forward with interest in serving, right? So the first group of people who step forward to serve are the people who need to feel liked and popular and whatever. We got to leapfrog over that initial group that puts their hand up. And then we've got to get to the people who don't really want to do it, but should because they have a particular skill set. But we'll never get to that if we don't understand that local government is for serious people. It's for dry, boring nerds who want to talk about and read this stuff, and not people who've ever cared about being liked, and so yes, we're running a popularity contest and we're getting the results of one.
In defense of public policy, because I feel like we both do it, but you do it more often than I do. Really taking public policy for a walk and saying how dry and boring and this, that, other thing. One of the few things that I have seen consistently on social media over the last 2 to 3 years are more and more people taking complex public policy, community development related topics and making them interesting and consumable, and not the dry, boring thing that they often turn into when inside of a boardroom. These things can be interesting. I think the problem a lot of times is whether you're an elected official or whether you are someone who's trying to just be a good a good person, good active person in your community, a lot of times people will fall into the trap of trying to be knower of all things and try to be like maximally educated and on top of all things. And it's just that's such a bad pursuit. One of the biggest pieces of feedback I've gotten over the last 7, 8 months of doing the Substack in focus is, people asking me why I don't write about these other things that I used to write about when I was writing regularly for the Finger Lakes Times. And my answer is like, I spend most of my days reading about and writing about housing and community development. I can't be as well spoken and engaged and thoughtful about topics that are way outside that as I could back when I kind of just went day by day, issue by issue. And I think we would be a lot better off, honestly, if more people tried to find something in government that they really were interested in and just focus on that thing. Kind of like taking the expertise, like the divide and conquer kind of thing. Like, you take this because you're really good at this and your brain works that way and you like this thing, you're interested in it. Don't try to be the expert in all of these other things that you're not that interested in. And, that's kind of when I hear that and we get talking about how like boring and dry public policy is, and I know it is in a lot of cases. That's what I think about. I think about how like there is an opportunity to make these topics more interesting. And there are people doing it, but they tend to focus on one thing. Like there's a guy that I've followed on TikTok for close to like 3 years now. He just talks about streets. Streets are his thing. And he dives into like how streets are planned and built, how they were, how they are in other countries historically, the mistakes that have been made, the opportunities, kind of like some of the unique things that exist out there too. And like, he probably knows stuff about other things too, but he focuses on that. And I think we'd have a better electorate and probably better governing bodies if more people did that, I think.
I agree. Maybe that is, I mean, yeah, I think, other communities have like committees where people who have a particular interest can get involved. Geneva's moving that way,
Yep.
at least in these kind of like ad hoc groups. I think that's great.
Yeah.
And I think helping people figure out, usually, the people who come out first are the people who are the angriest about a particular topic and they get kind of funneled into whatever it is that they're most angry about. But I think there is a way I mean, I find this stuff just intrinsically exciting, right? So I understand I'm not the best
Yeah.
person to try to like get someone super excited about municipal government because I am just wired to think it's interesting. But I do think there are ways to get people engaged and find the particular aspect of municipal government that they could relate to, want to learn more about, and just kind of assemble a group of people who care. It's almost like you're talking about what a town board or city council or board of supervisors should be. Curious people who have a particular interest, who want to learn something and then share it with other people and make good decisions.
Yeah. And it's funny, like if anybody is listening right now and they're not an elected person, the non-electeds who are listening right now, this is a way to also just, have interesting conversations with people. Figure out the thing that you really care about. And, as you're going through, you probably have spent some time educating yourself on whatever that thing is. Like have those conversations with people. Like that's how all of this begins, especially in small communities. Like it and you'd be amazed at what will come of that, just having more of those conversations. We do have our last question of the day came from Substack, and it's actually about vetting. Here's the quote. Quote, beyond being a friend of someone or knowing a person directly, how are residents supposed to know who they can trust to manage complicated local governments, budgets, and systems, especially when most people don't have the time or resources to deeply research every candidate or official? This question came in response to our last episode and a column that I wrote about Seneca Falls after the town supervisor there was arrested. And there's just kind of been years of tumult within town government there in Seneca Falls. That was the question. I thought it was really interesting because I think it kind of gets at what the really engaged person struggles with in these communities. It's hard, other than getting a couple mailers. And I know candidates say, like, here's my phone number. Anybody can call me anytime. But, most voters aren't going, even if they're really engaged and really interested, most voters aren't going to call a random phone number and say, you know, why should I vote for you again? Like, who are you? Like, tell me about what you're doing. I'm sure some of them would answer and do it, but you're just not going to get a lot of people to do that. So the question, what do you say to that person? What are residents supposed to do in these communities where, the time and resources don't necessarily exist for people to do deep research?
Well, I think we should do an episode just on red flags and green flags in local candidates.
Ooh, oh,
What
that's a good
makes
one.
it because
Yes.
I can say, first of all, let me just say, like, I am naive and trusting, so I am not a good person to be able to. I can't tell you the number of elected officials that I have been enthusiastic about and then incredibly disappointed by. So I fall for the catchphrases and words too. So I totally get that. I will say, over decades of watching local government, there are a couple of key things that make me want to run the opposite way from somebody who's running for office, even if I know them, even if I like them. If the first things or their primary qualification for the job, remember, they're interviewing for a job. If the thing they lead with is that they've just been there a long time, interesting. But like, if that's the best you have to offer, you're probably not the best candidate. You maybe could tell me why your lived experience in the community has given you a particular perspective that is worth voting for. But just someone who's like, yeah, because you know me. Like, that's a problem. And now in the age of AI, people who are clearly using AI to do their communicating are the people I'm most leery about, because they're the people most likely to make a pretty big mistake and not even know it. And we should be looking for people who have some humility, who are like, yeah, I don't know the answer, but here's how I would approach the question. Or who just want to listen. But
Yeah.
yeah, AI
I go
slop.
back to the radio days. I go back to the radio days listening to you say that. Longtime listener, first time caller. That's the elected version of that. Yeah, you
Yeah.
know what? My red flag, and we're definitely going to do that. That episode is most definitely happening. So if
Oh,
you're
good.
watching or
Good.
listening to
That'll be
that
a
one,
fun one.
get ready. That one's going to be coming down the road. For me, it's and this goes back to my days doing election season interviews, interviewing candidates running for office. I'm really looking forward to learning more about this job while you're on the campaign trail, while you're 20 to 30 days away from potentially taking the job or being chosen to do the job. I know there's some time between election and taking office, and you could conceivably learn how to do the job in 2 or 3 months, but probably not that great. I would say beyond that, look to see if you have no access to the things like their actual policy positions, and you're just looking for someone you want to know that they're at least going to be engaged. I would say the two things I'd point to are attitude toward criticism, like how well do they take criticism or appear to take criticism, because odds are if they're running, they've been criticized at some point, and you can tell a lot from how they react to it. The second piece I would say is, go to a meeting or two in the run up to election day and take a look and see if they're there. They showing up to meetings? They're not showing up to meetings before they're elected. That should give you reason for pause.
Right.
I
Or if
think.
they've never gone to a meeting until they launched their candidacy for election, like, then why or how did you find out and decide you wanted to do